The Bold and Climate podcast is honored to welcome today someone who is often cited as one of the most influential environmentalists in history, Bill McKibben. He's credited with writing the first popular science book about climate change, The End of Nature, in 1989, in which he explained global warming to general audiences, establishing that human activity has fundamentally altered the planet's climate system. His most recent book, released in 2025, called Here Comes the Sun, takes a look at the soaring potential of solar and renewable energy. In between, he has spent several decades documenting atmospheric warming and the resultant intensification of extreme weather events, the inherent inequality of fossil fuels as an energy source, climate justice questions, while also mobilizing people to take climate centered action. He has received numerous honors, including the Right Livelihood Award and the Gandhi Peace Prize. Welcome to the show, Bill.
What a pleasure to be with you.
So we'll maybe start off with what really drew me to your work, which was your first book, The End of Nature. It was the first kind of book to break down for a general audience just how badly human civilization had kind of broken the climate. But your 2025 book, which I'm yet to read, um, I'm told brings a kind of genuinely hopeful tone. What has changed in these three odd decades, and how has it influenced your writing?
Well, so here's the thing. I wrote that first book, The End of Nature, back in the 1980s, so almost 40 years ago now. And it was the first book about what we now call the climate crisis, what we then called the greenhouse effect. And in those 40 years, all the things that scientists said would happen are happening. We're seeing the rapid rise in temperature and the rapid rise in sea level. We're seeing the extraordinary heat waves, which certainly those of you in East Asia have seen more than any place on Earth. We've seen the horrible wildfires on my continent and the extraordinary floods in so many places. Um, we're seeing really the rapid breakdown of the climate system. But finally, we all of a sudden have a tool with which to fight that. Not to prevent it, it's too late, sadly, to stop global warming, but maybe not too late to start shaving tenths of a degree off how hot it eventually gets. And the tool that we now have all of a sudden is the availability of cheap, clean energy, especially solar energy, wind energy, and the batteries to store that energy when the sun goes down or the wind drops. Uh, you know, Human beings have um, spent the last 700,000 years setting things on fire. It's been sort of how humans have. Darwin said that language and fire were the two things that distinguished our species. But the fires now are causing too many problems. They're causing the climate crisis. As you know, in India, they cause an immense public health crisis because the air gets so terrible. The last statistics I saw said that of the 5 million children in New Delhi, 2.5 million had irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air. The last time I was in New Delhi, I couldn't see the flag in Connaught Square there. The air was so terrible. And we also see that depending on fossil fuel to burn uh, leaves us in the hands of the worst people on earth. Uh, you know, Vladimir Putin invading the Ukraine or Donald Trump seizing Venezuela because he wants its oil or whatever it is. And so the quite good news is that we don't have to do that anymore. There's sun and wind everywhere on this planet, and everyone can quickly take advantage of that if we set our minds to it. And I got to say, it's been astonishing over the last year or so to watch just how fast that change is starting to come in India. Um, India seems to have peaked its use of coal. Uh, uh, and if so, that's a great help to the rest of the world. India may become the first big country to go through it's industrialization without relying mostly on fossil fuel. It's possible that sun and wind have arrived in time to power India's rise over the next few decades. And if so, that'll be a great blessing for India and for the whole planet.
Right. And, in kind of researching for this interview, I came across one of the lines from your book. You say, "We are on the verge of turning to the heavens for energy instead of to hell." And this is probably not, you're just not writing about this, you're also a practitioner of this. You have actively adapted and adopted solar power in your life. What inspired you to write this book and to go down this path?
Well, I very much wanted to tell people this news, in part because I, I don't think people still have quite realized how big this change is. So we've been calling things like solar power and wind power alternative energy my whole life, and it sort of makes them sound like they're over on the side, that they're sort of marginal, that the real energy is coal and gas and oil. But that's just not true anymore. 95% of new generating capacity around the world last year came from wind and sun. And so I wanted to help get that message across. And of course, I particularly wanted to get it across in my own country, the United States, because we're in well, I mean, we elected an idiot president of our country, and he thinks that solar power doesn't work, and wind doesn't work, and on and on and on. So it's really important here in America to let people know just how out of touch with the rest of the world we're becoming.
Right. So we'll kind of get into why we need a transition to renewable energy. And solar itself, we've kind of taken about 70 years after the PV solar cell was invented to install a terawatt of power in 2022. But since then, there has been a rapid proliferation of solar as a power source. What, according to you, has caused this uptick across
So,
geographies?
about 5 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power from the sun and wind than from burning coal or gas or oil. And I mean, much cheaper. The data I've seen for India, for instance, indicates that it's now cheaper to build a new solar farm in India than to buy the coal for an existing coal-fired power plant, which is, if you think about it, completely remarkable. Um, because it got so cheap, people around the world started very quickly to turn in this direction. Now, the leaders here have been the Chinese. They were the ones who did a lot of the work to figure out how to mass produce these things at ever cheaper prices, and their government has been in the forefront of adopting them. But now many other countries are starting to do the same thing. India has set up serious production capacity for solar panels, for instance. Um, and now we're seeing in Africa the very rapid spread of solar power. You've probably heard the stories about what's happened in Pakistan over the last few years with the very, very rapid uptake of solar panels because they have such an expensive and unreliable electric system. Um, this is, in very short order, transforming things in a very powerful way. Now, the problem is that climate change is so far advanced that we're going to have to move even faster if we have some hope of heading off the worst of climate change. But we could. We have the factory capacity to produce a terawatt's worth of solar panels every year. In 10 years, we could have produced enough solar panels to provide as much energy as the world is currently using. Um, um, so it's not that it's impossible, but it's going to take a lot of people working hard. So here in the United States, for instance, I've founded a group called Third Act that organizes old people like me, people over the age of 60. And our two tasks are defending democracy, which is obviously hard with Donald Trump as president, and defending the climate. One of the things we're doing all over America now is helping push for new laws that make it much easier to put solar panels up on your roof and things like that. So lots and lots of old people engaged in this work now. It's fun. And of course, lots and lots of youth who have been leading on this fight all along, beginning with people like Greta Thunberg.
Right. So you kind of mentioned how China has been leading the charge, and in the past decade or so, developing countries have actually been front and center in adopting solar and other sources of renewable energy,
Mhm.
and this has quite literally shifted power centers right away from traditional controllers of fossil fuel-based
Mhm.
power. Um, could you tell us specifically in the global south what is driving these countries to adopt renewable energy sources, both maybe the cost saving aspects as well as the energy
So
security
there's
aspects?
there's I think a bunch of things. The most fundamental thing to remember is that 80% of human beings live in countries that are net importers of fossil fuel. And so if they can if they can replace some of that fossil fuel with sun and wind, which you don't have to buy from somebody else, it's all to the better. India spends 5% of its GDP importing fossil fuel. That's a lot, that's a huge sum of money. And, you know, I, I've been to India many times. I'm well aware of the fact that it has lots of sun. Um, it does not need to import any sun at all. It's got more than it knows what to do with some of the time. I've had some of the hottest days I ever spent were in India. Um, and so that's the first reason. But now a new reason is emerging, you know, having everything to do with political security. So let's talk about Donald Trump again. Um, he's trying to, with the threat of tariffs, uh, pretty much force other countries to buy American natural gas and oil. They may do it for a little while, to appease him, but I think they'll all decide pretty quickly. We what we really want to do is buy a lot of solar panels so we're not dependent on anyone. I don't know why you would want to be dependent on Donald Trump for your energy supply, because from one day to the next he might change his mind completely about whether he likes you or not. You know, and so countries would be well advised to figure out how to make sure they don't depend on him or Vladimir Putin or the King of Saudi Arabia or anybody else.
Right. And for a few years now, you've kind of been bullish about India as well, leading the charge in this transition. In your view, can India actually start to jump past fossil fuels straight to renewables?
I believe so. I think the economics are very, very useful. Now, India has its own fossil fuel lobby, just like the United States. There are huge coal companies and they're very connected with the government and so on. But I think that the economic logic is so strong that it seems to be shaping how India is responding here. And uh, uh, you know, part of what we're learning that really makes me happy is that it's quite possible to do this alternative energy in conjunction with other things. So we're talking a lot about this stuff we call agrovoltaics, which just means growing food in the same places that we've got solar panels. One of the things that solar panels produce, besides electrons, is shade. Um, and so there are lots and lots of crops that are very useful for that. People are figuring out how to put floating solar panels on ponds and reservoirs to keep the rate of evaporation down. Um, it cycles beautifully into some of those, permaculture systems where you have, uh, uh, you know, uh, animal production that feeds fish farming, and so on and so forth. And you can get some biogas too, and lots and lots of different possibilities. Um, I've I've spent enough time in India to know how resourceful people are, especially maybe at the village level, um, and how good they are at taking technologies and making them work. As this becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, I think we're going to see more and more and more of it. I also think that the things that come with the supply of cheap electricity are super useful, maybe more for India than almost any place in the world. So, uh, you know, we read now, I haven't been to India for the last couple of years, but I read that in the big cities, we're replacing gas powered rickshaws, three wheelers, with electric motors, um, and in the process, improving the air and making it a little more quiet in some of those places, which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Um, so I think that there are lots and lots of possibilities. And since I think India is one of the most magical and beautiful and interesting places on the planet. I'm very hopeful that it's going to figure out lots of new and interesting ways to use these technologies.
Right. And you kind of earlier mentioned that just the sheer uh, case of it becoming cheaper is helping solar kind of come into the picture. But for a country with the kind of population like India has, do you think renewables like solar would actually be affordable for the majority of the people here?
They're more affordable than the alternatives. That's what we were talking about before. You can literally put up a new solar farm and generate electricity from it more cheaply than just buying the coal to keep a coal-fired power plant going. The thing to understand about the economics of something like solar power is all the cost is upfront. You have to pay for the panels and to put them up. But once you've done that, then you don't have to pay anything because the sun delivers the energy for free, you know. So it's a very different model. And what it requires is some financing to allow people to build the thing in the first place. But that gets easier and easier the cheaper these things get. And also it gets easier the better we get at figuring out models for how to finance it. In the same way that, as the car industry developed, people figured out how to get car loans and things. Now people are figuring out how to do this. It's particularly susceptible in the poorest parts of India to the kind of microfinance that we've seen across East Asia. I remember being in Bangladesh 20 years ago and watching Grameen and Brock and others roll out these remarkable solar packages across the most rural parts of Bangladesh. Um, um, and now we see that in Pakistan too, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, it's none of it's easy, and none of it's, it could be easier if there was real global cooperation, but unfortunately, the United States is now getting in the way of that. So it's going to be harder than it should be, but I think it's doable.
And to kind of really spell out the importance of solar and to give our listeners a little bit of perspective, in any given year, how much energy is currently flowing into the global economy from, say, top solar companies across the world versus from big oil?
So at the moment, the big Chinese uh, solar makers are producing more energy capacity in a year than the big oil companies are. China sold half again as much green energy technology to the world last year as the US sold oil and gas. It's very interesting. But it's what's so interesting is just to remember that we can do this at many, many different scales. So there are huge solar farms, say, or huge offshore wind turbines, but there are also people who are just hanging a solar panel off their balcony. Um, because I'm old, uh, many of my heroes are from the 20th century, and one of my greatest heroes, of course, is Gandhi. Um, and I think that if Gandhi were alive right now, his symbol would be not the spinning wheel, but the solar panel. I think it serves the same role of independence, self-sufficiency, that the spinning wheel did in Gandhi's day, and makes me very happy to hear that his ashram now has solar panels all over the roof. My other great hero from that period was Gandhi's Pakistani counterpart, Ghaffar Abdul Khan, Badshah Khan, sometimes called the Frontier Gandhi. And I think of him when I see those pictures of solar panels going up all over, Rawalpindi and wherever. I really do think that this is the kind of liberating energy in many, many ways. Just because you don't, once you have it, you don't depend on someone else. You don't have to depend on someone showing up with a truck full of oil, or you don't have to pay for the next delivery of gas. You just have power in your own hands now and in your community's hands. I've spent a lot of time in Africa where there are hundreds of millions of people without any power at all. And the first power they're going to get and are now getting comes from these solar microgrids and things. And it's very beautiful to see.
In fact, that was something I was going to ask you about, um, based off actually a recent Substack that you wrote in the Crucial Years. You spoke about solar as solidarity and as a form of liberation, essentially to say that with small scale solar, anyone can be part of the revolution. What does, in your view, energy democracy look like for countries like Africa and India and others which have massive electrification needs, for the poorest and most remotely located communities?
Well, look, these are places, in most of Africa, fossil fuel might as well never have existed. It never did any good. I mean, we've had coal for 250 years, and there's 600, 700 million Africans without access to electricity, and they're never going to get it. No one's going to build a big grid out to rural parts of Africa, but they're getting it almost overnight thanks to the availability of cheap solar panels. And so what energy democracy looks like is people having their own access to and control over energy. The two things that we most need in the world, really, the commodities are food and water and energy. And if any of those things are completely outside your control, then you're someone else's you know, slave at some level. You depend on them, and that's, I mean, we live in a world where we're good at trading things back and forth, and that makes sense. But it doesn't make any sense to ship energy halfway around the world when the sun will deliver it every morning to wherever you are. You and so I'm, as you can tell, I'm very, very worried about the climate crisis. And I think the effects are going to be terrible. I think they're going to challenge the ability of civilizations to cope with and continue, because I'm afraid that the damage is just going to get worse and worse for the next couple of decades. But I can also see the possibility for a fairer, stronger, more democratic civilization on the other side of all of this too, with clean local energy at its core.
Right. If we could just take maybe a moment to understand um, how storage technologies and batteries could change what's
Sure.
possible for solar over the next
So
decade. Yeah.
batteries are the most exciting thing at the moment. They're changing so fast. Um, um, And what they do now that we have very cheap batteries is essentially mean that the sun doesn't set and the wind doesn't ever drop. Um, um, we now have batteries cheap enough and that can store power long enough to basically allow you to run your whatever system you need to run off sun and wind power. Um, and it's very beautiful to see that happening and to see how fast it's happening. Um, California now at night, when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California are batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. Those batteries didn't exist 3 years ago. They're brand new. Um, and this is starting to play out all across the planet. And we're getting better at this with every passing month. The Chinese, the new cars in China aren't all using lithium ion batteries. Many of them are now using sodium ion batteries, sodium, salt, the fifth most common element in the Earth's crust, the thing that Gandhi demonstrated that we all could make easily, by ourselves. So um, the possibilities here are just crazy. But batteries are very key to this story. They're the thing that makes it completely possible to do, and the scale of it's crazy. So in Vermont, the state in America where I live, our biggest power plant now isn't a power plant. It's what we call a virtual power plant. Of the 10 or 15,000 people in Vermont who have batteries in their basement, but they're tied by the computer to the grid. And so the power company can call on them on the hottest days of the year when they're facing a peaking load to just get power out of those batteries. If America converted its entire automobile fleet to electric vehicles, the batteries of those cars would have enough energy to run all of America for 3 days. Um, this is a very different world.
Right. And in terms of panel efficiency itself, how close are we to hitting peak panel efficiency and the limits of it? And what next once we do that?
So you would have said that we were. I think people would have said we were getting fairly close a few years ago, but now there's this new family of solar panels, Perskovite solar panels that interlay another it's technical and complicated, but interlay another sort of set of matrices atop a solar panel, and they seem to be have big increases in efficiency. And um, uh, the only problem was they didn't seem robust in the weather, but they seem to have cracked that problem, and they'll be on sale, in the next few years. But the solar panels are already so efficient that that's not really I mean, it'll be good to have them yet more efficient, but they're already incredibly efficient and cheap. And one of the interesting things about them is they get cheaper each year just because we get much, much better. So for instance, I have solar panels on my roof that we put up in 1999 or so. They're still working great. And so before you were born, they're still working great. And, uh, you know, but if we wanted to take them down and replace them with new solar panels, the stuff that we could recycle out of those old generation, one panel has enough silver in it to produce six new panels. Okay. So we just keep getting better and better and better at this all the time. It's kind of a miracle. Um, the sun is kind of a miracle. The sun already gives us light and warmth, and via photosynthesis it gives us our dinner, and now it's willing to provide all the power we could ever need. And we're very lucky, and that's a great gift, and it would be a huge sin to waste it, I think.
Right. You just not been touched upon the recyclability of old panels, and critics often point out to this as a problem in adapting solar is the waste produced by the panels. What is your view on this, and what developments have taken place in
So,
panel recyclability or policy shifts
so
that
we're
can
getting
be?
they're now quite easy to recycle, but so far we haven't had to recycle very many of them because they keep working much longer than they're supposed to. So they were usually warranted for 25 years, but now they're lasting much longer than that, and the warranties on the new systems are often for 40 years. Um, but when they degrade, we can recycle them in many ways. So, so you know the so for instance, I mean, a solar panel itself is easy to recycle. It's like recycling a window. It's just basically glass and so the aluminum that it's mounted in and things. And these are things we're good at recycling. They're easy to do. Batteries are probably a little more complicated, but not that hard. The stuff that's in them, say lithium, is we know how to recycle, and it's valuable enough that we will recycle it. I mean, and so the amount of mining that you have to do in this system goes way, way, way down because because if someone asks you about the recyclability of solar panels, I mean, you can assure them that they're easy to recycle, and then you should ask them, how easy is it to recycle coal? Um, you can't recycle coal. You burn it, and then you have to go get some more tomorrow. And the waste product from that, CO2, is the thing that's destroying the planet. So I would not worry very much about the environmental downsides of solar and wind. They're incredibly small compared to the crisis that we're causing by burning fossil fuel.
Right. We also earlier kind of touched upon the inherent inequality of fossil fuel as an energy source. Would you say that while solar is most readily available, does it also run the risk of going that way in terms of high upfront financial costs or mining of the raw materials, any of these aspects?
Well, I mean, there are, you got to go mine lithium and things, right? You don't have to mine anywhere near as much of it as you do for coal, but we should definitely try and make sure that the people who live in the places where it's getting mined are treated fairly and that it becomes a positive thing for them. But there's always, I mean, mining usually ends up being a bad thing um, on our planet, which is one reason why it's nice to imagine a system that mines a lot less. But I think in the largest terms, this is the best news that the developing world has had in a long time. Um, the sun works well everywhere, but it works best when you get towards the equator. Uh, India's got a lot better solar resource than Vermont does. I mean, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here in Vermont, and you can see the sun going down behind me. Um, so I think this is the greatest possible gift to the developing world, to anyone who doesn't want to depend on the very few places where we have deposits of fossil fuel. Uh, you know, and it's also, of course, the the developing world that's going to pay the biggest price for climate change. Um, Already is. India pays a tremendous price for the increase in temperature, and that's going to get much, much, much worse. As the Himalayas melt and as the Bay of Bengal rises, and as the flow of the Ganges continues to dwindle, and all those things that are just inevitable if we keep raising the temperature. I don't know whether you read or not the extraordinary novel, global warming novel by an American named Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry for the Future. But it opens with a horrible, horrible imagining of a mass heat wave across India where many million people die, which is, I'm afraid, entirely plausible in the world that we're creating. You've seen in April and May and June of recent years sustained temperatures across much of India that are at the very level of human tolerance. You know, people having to, people who can't, work in the fields, people who can't do the work, construction work, do any of the other outdoor work just because it's gotten too hot. Our bodies can't deal with it. So anything that turns down the temperature a little bit is a huge help to, it seems to me, to probably India more than almost any other country on earth.
Right. And just the final question, you had earlier touched upon Third Act and how you mobilize people over the age of 60 for climate action. Why specifically people over the age of 60? What was your thinking?
Well, there's a lot of us in the United States, um, but we have, so there's several reasons. One, older people have a lot of time, and that makes it, I mean, young people have time too. So these are the two groups that I think really have the capacity to change the world. People who are in the middle of their working life and raising young children, it's very hard for them to be in the forefront of this kind of work. But older people also have a lifetime of skills and that they have built up and the sort of network of friends and people that they know. And for this generation of older people in particular, they also have something very useful. If you're in your 70s or 80s now, it means that your first act, back when we were your age, was in the 1960s and the 1970s, in this period of extraordinary social and cultural and political transformation where we saw women start to be taken seriously. The height of the civil rights movement, the first Earth Day in the US, 20 million Americans in the streets. So we know, I think, in a way that younger people sometimes doubt, that it is entirely possible to make big change in the world if we come together to demand it. So we love working with young people. That's basically our job, figuring out how to back them up in the work that they're doing. But older people have a really serious and important part to play in this. And it's good, much fun to organize with people. I spent much of my life working with young people, organizing with young people. We founded a thing called 350.org that became the first big global grassroots climate campaign. But now I'm really enjoying working with older people too. Um, and, you know, we, again, draw great inspiration from great figures in the past. Gandhi was an old man by the time he was doing much of his work in India. And so we obviously not going to be Gandhis, but we can, at least take inspiration from that work and do what we can.
Right. And just one last question on Sunday, this climate project that
Yeah,
you organized that
yeah.
kind of aims to make climate energy, clean energy, personal and hopeful. Does hope, after all of these years of working in the space, do you think hope wins over outrage and fear when it comes to moving policy and helping us help the environment?
I think we probably need some of everything.
Mm.
But I do think hope is important. If people don't think that there's some way out of these problems, then they may just give up. And that would be too bad because though we're not going to stop global warming, we can keep it from getting worse than it has to get. Each each tenth of a degree that we raise the temperature of the planet moves 100 million of our brothers and sisters from a safe climate zone to a dangerous one. Each tenth of a degree, 100 million people. So this is the most important work that any of us could be doing in this world. And I'm very grateful to you and your colleagues for the work that you're doing along these lines. Thank you for it.
This really was a very enlightening conversation, and we thank you so much for your time.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, subscribe to the Boring Climate Podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast.